Justin Pollard, how are you?
I'm very well.
Good.
Thank you very much for inviting me along.
Oh, well, thank you for coming. Let's break the ice. What are we drinking today?
Today we are drinking a single barrel bourbon.
Ooh.
So I'm very fond of the old whiskey, old bourbon, and this is one of the very nicest. It's not the sort of thing I'd normally drink at lunchtime, but you know, when in Rome.
When in Rome. Cheers. Oh, that's very good.
It's fabulous.
Oh, it's fabulous. Right, so I want to start at the beginning. Where did your love for history originate from?
Well, back at school, of course, when I was sort of very little. And mainly, though, I did have brilliant history teachers, but the main thing was actually the Asterix the Gaul books, which, you know, these French cartoon books, in which rather than see sort of history just written out as a narrative, you actually had characters talking. You had stroppy Gauls, you had vain Julius Caesar, you had very sort of gorgeous Cleopatra. And it just made them real characters. And after that, I just felt I wanted to go back in time and sort of summon ghosts on the stage.
Yeah, so it brought the story to life for
Exactly,
you.
yeah. I suppose, I wanted to do historical drama, really, but I didn't realise it at the time.
Yeah. Okay, so you obviously were a lover of history in school. You then went to the University of Cambridge, you worked at the Museum of London. So how did you realise that there was potentially a gap in the market for a historical advisor in the film industry? And what made you take that leap from academics to film?
Well, like most people in the film business, chance largely, really. I mean, I thought, when I was at Cambridge, I thought I was going to be an archaeologist. And I read archaeology, and I went to the Museum of London, and I was a medievalist and digging in London. And this was in the early 90s, and there was a big recession, and the unit I worked for went bankrupt over the space of one weekend. So I went home on Friday, came back in on Monday and didn't have a job. I started doing TV research, documentary research. And then really, quite by chance, I got a call from Working Title. And Working Title had decided they were going to do a movie about Elizabeth I. And they're going to have some really sort of interesting casting and crewing for it. They were going to get an Indian director in, Shekhar Kapoor, who'd just done Bandit Queen. Kate Blanchett, who was a young but very up-and-coming Australian actress, was going to play Elizabeth. And they thought, well, with a young Australian Elizabeth and an Indian director, we probably ought to get some sort of historical sort of basis for it. Shekhar wanted someone who could actually be on set every day to do all of those sort of little things you do, the etiquette. Someone walks into a room, do I bow to him? Do they bow to me? Who bows lower? Who eats first? Does the Queen sit down? If the Queen doesn't sit down, can I sit down? And the characters also wanted to know about themselves. So Kate, being a very thorough actress, she wanted to know all the music Elizabeth listened to. She wanted to know the books she'd read.
Wow.
So we went through all of that, and the same with Geoffrey Rush, all of their background character. And quite by chance, I ended up spending 18 weeks on set, just sort of helping to sort of build up this world, this sort of new Elizabethan view of England. And I saw there was more and more history drama being made and history movies being made, particularly after Elizabeth. And thought, well, there's a great opportunity here to use the sort of the skills from documentary research and writing. And it was just sort of to try and weave all of that in and weave in more background history, because truth is usually stranger than fiction.
Okay, but you can't possibly know everything about history. So talk me through your approach to when they phone you and they say, Justin, we want you on this production, to the point that they start filming. What do you have to do your research and to get ready for filming day?
You do the basic background reading to make sure you are up to speed on it. Then we keep a very big network of academics.
Okay.
And so having got back up to basic speed, I then will call around all of those academics and usually try and meet up with them or buy them a spot of lunch. And so I will go through them, and they can then bring me very quickly up to speed on what all the latest thought and research is. And because they have a vast background in that particular subject, if I'm looking for a particular moment, a vignette, a little idea, they will be able to get to it very quickly.
Okay.
And then we can take that and rework it up in a way that's sort of suitable for a script and suitable for a film crew into something that's shootable.
Do you ever work with the writer in the early days at all?
Very often with Michael Hurst, since Elizabeth, almost everything we've done together, so Tudors, Camelot, Vikings, we did both Elizabeth movies. And Michael is fabulous, because he writes character brilliantly.
Yeah.
But he's very receptive to ideas for the setting for it. So for Vikings, he wanted to do a show about Vikings, showing that they're not just a bunch of thugs who go around beating people up. It's not actually a macho society, and it's not. It's a very egalitarian society for its date. But he needed a story to hang it on. So he asked me, and I suggested we should do Ragnar and his children, because I'd written about Ragnar and his children in a book of mine. And so he took that and then brought all these characters back to life. So I provided what we knew about Ragnar and his children's lives and the events, and he then breathed life back into them. And that is the best way to work. It's, on set, it tends to be just, you know, little bits and bobs, but where you can really help rebuild the world, that is fantastic.
Speaking of Vikings, you've written a book on Vikings, and obviously you've been working on the series. So what is it? Because Vikings, it's kind of different to some of the other stuff that you've done in terms of the books that you've written, and you seem to be quite involved with British history. So what is it about the Vikings that captured your attention initially and made you want to delve deeper into them as people?
Well, it was an Englishman, actually, strangely enough. There was an English king called Alfred the Great in the 9th century, who's very unusual in that he was literate. He could write. The next king after him who could read and write was Henry VIII, so that just goes to show how rubbish most of our medieval kings were. And so we have some of his writings, some of his thoughts, and he's clearly a very deep thinker. And he really tried to start building the country that became later England. It was just Wessex in his time. But the greatest threat he found were the Vikings who were attacking at the time. So I wanted to write a book about him. And so the book I wrote was very much about how he learnt to deal with the Viking threat, which was very much, you know, they were the enemy. And so I wrote it very much from that perspective. But the Vikings were something that interested Michael, and because he wanted to turn the story on its head, really. He'd read my Alfred the Great book, and we'd thought of doing Alfred the Great as the story, but it's a bit esoteric, perhaps, for a lot of people, Alfred the Great. Not everyone knows who he is. It can sound a bit sort of jingoistic and sort of, you know, British flag waving. And so Michael's idea was, well, why don't we do it the other way round? Why don't we, instead of starting in England and seeing these, you know, fearful invaders coming over, let's go and start with farmers in Scandinavia and see what's driving them, what's motivating them. Let's show the world that they're not just sort of monsters coming off the ocean, that in fact they're probably the most advanced Northern European society at the time. You know, women had rights, which, you know, doesn't sound a lot, but in 9th century, there's nowhere else really where they have much in the way of rights. And by the time you get through to the Norman conquest in the 11th century, women become possessions of men, you know, they're chattels by that point. So a society where we could show, it wasn't all going to be just, you know, big men with axes. We could show powerful women who also fought in battles. They're not just sort of powerful, nurturing home characters. They're complete actors in the whole scene. And we had, you know, Kate Winnett, who's just Catherine Winnett, who's astonishing. And I have 2 daughters. And so I'm quite keen to rebalance history.
Good.
Put half the population back in it. And so really it comes from Michael, that he took my love of Alfred the Great and turned it on its head and said, yeah, but what about these guys who he hated? And of course the result was this brilliant balance, actually. Michael ended up loving Alfred the Great, and I ended up loving the Vikings.
Let's talk a bit about QI. One of my favorite shows, and I know it's one of Britain's most loved shows. So how did you first get involved with QI?
Again, through documentaries, strangely enough. The founder of QI, John Lloyd, who was the producer of Blackadder, was having dinner with a director I've been working with on a documentary series, and he said he'd had this idea for sort of an unusual quiz show in which nobody knew the answers, and everything was wrong, or everything you thought you knew turned out to be wrong. And this director said, oh, I know someone who'd be good at that. And so John rang me up and explained what the idea for QI was and said, did I fancy doing it? And the great thing about it is like being a perpetual student doing it. The brief is go away and find interesting stuff. That's the beginning and end of it.
Oh, that's brilliant.
There's no more to it than that.
So, along with being a producer, writer, historical advisor, you're also an entrepreneur. Yes.
Well, sort of, yes.
Sort of.
Yeah.
You co-founded Unbound. So what was your motivation behind Unbound? And tell us a little bit more about it.
Well, that came out, as I was saying, being a writer is very helpful if you want to be a historical advisor because you need something else to do. So I decided with a friend of mine, Dan Kieran, who was editing a magazine called The Idler, that we might sort of move out into drama. So we got together a few times, and one time, like writers do, we got together and we had lunch and we went to the pub. And like all writers do, we were whinging about how, the advances we got were getting lower and lower. We thought if we can just find the fans of your books, then you can write a book for them and they'll pay for it. And then next time you can say, hey, I want to write another book. And you can go to those fans again. And you're talking to people who want
it's very
what
smart.
you want. So I have an old friend, Terry Jones, who was in Monty Python, who I'd worked with years before. And I went round to see Terry for a beer. There's a theme developing here. And we went to the pub. And I was saying that, we'd had this sort of daft idea about sort of crowdfunding books. And he said, well, I've got a book you can have. And I thought, really? Really? And then, no, you can have my book. And he'd written a book called Evil Machines that had been an opera originally that he'd written, but he'd made a book. And I said, that's brilliant. And I remember I went home that night, and I rang Dan on the way and said, that idea we had? We might have to actually do it now because we've got a book from, one of Monty Python, which left us with one problem in that neither of us knew how on earth you make books. And we could write books, but I had no idea how.
Put it together.
But fortunately, I was doing QI at the time with John Mitchinson. John Mitchinson has previously been a publisher, famous publisher, before he was doing QI. And he'd sworn never to go back into publishing. But we said, if we could do this, would you come back and actually, do the publishing bit? And unbelievably, he agreed. So the three of us founded the company together.
That's amazing.
And here we still are.
Yeah.
So.
If you could go back to any period in history, what would it be and why?
It's a good question. I normally get asked, what period would you most like to live in? To which the answer is always, well, now, obviously. I would always recommend to anyone, if you get a choice what period in history you live in, try and live in the present. The medical care's better, the food's better. It's definitely best to be alive now if you can. But for interest, Alexandria in Egypt in about 260, 270 BC, something like that, around the reign of Ptolemy II, who was the son of one of Alexander the Great's generals who took over Egypt after Alexander died. And they rebuilt Alexandria as this amazing sort of part Greek, part Egyptian city. They had Alexander the Great's body there on show in a crystal coffin. And of course, Ptolemy started building, the greatest library the world had ever seen. He decided he would collect a copy of every book in existence.
Oh my goodness.
And he did. And the Library of Alexandria was the wonder of the ancient world. Everything was contained there. And when he couldn't get hold of a book, he would steal it, or occasionally Greek cities would demand a huge ransom to lend him a book. And he'd say, can I borrow your copy of, Aristophanes, and I'll copy it and send it back to you. And they say, well, yes, if you give us a few equivalent of £1 million. And you get the copy and then just say, keep the money. And you keep the original.
Wow.
But the library, the philosophy, there were public philosophers, the free education in the street. It was a renaissance. It was one of the greatest times to be alive.
If you could break the ice, meaning have a drink with anyone, past or present, who would it be and why?
It would be, there were quite a few actually.
Oh, I'm sure.
Depends on the drink, the venue, and who else is there. But if I had to choose one, I suppose I'd choose Hypatia, who was the last librarian at Alexandria.
Okay.
In the early Christian period, she was, her father, Theon, had been a great astronomer. She was a Neoplatonist philosopher, a humanist, really. She was a woman in charge of the greatest library in the world, which was fine in Alexandria, which just goes to show what a great place it was. But this was during the rise of early Christianity, and in particular, not that there's anything wrong with early Christianity, that had been, much of it had been formed in Alexandria. The Septuagint, the first versions of the Greek Bible were written in Alexandria. But there was an archbishop called Cyril at the time
Cyril.
who deeply disliked Hypatia. He disliked Neoplatonism. He disliked pagan religion. He disliked women. And he whipped up a crowd in the marketplace, and they dragged Hypatia from her work and tore her to pieces with cockle shells. And that and destroyed much of the library, and that really marks the beginning of the Dark Ages, the end of the ancient world. I would love to have known what she knew before that happened, to have lived in that world, for all its terrible end, for the moment she had living in that world where you could still be that sort of philosopher with access to that sort of, all the knowledge of the ancient world. That would be a wonderful thing to do.
Very interesting, yeah. Wow. Well, Justin, thank you for breaking the ice with
Well,
us.
thank you.
Cheers to living in the present.
Absolutely, always do.
Always.
Yeah.
Hey guys, thank you so much for watching. If you want to see more inspirational videos just like this, then don't forget to subscribe, which you can do by clicking right over here. Also, leave us a comment in the section below and tell us who you guys would like us to break the ice with next.